Hello, hello.
Hello.
Lloyd.
Hey, Danny, how are you? Sebastian,
Good.
Chris,
I'm here too. I'm
Hi,
just
Lloyd.
you don't want to see the bags under my eyes, put it that way.
a disembodied voice from
It's the
somewhere
it's
in
the
the
young
ether.
young daddy life.
So I'm just going to be off cam for today, if you don't mind.
Howdy, Sebastian, Lloyd, Nori, Raphael, Jeremy. Hello, Christina, Mohammed.
Fortunately, I can only stay 30 minutes, but I'm happy to kick it off with you.
Great.
Amazing. All right. Yoram's in the waiting room, so let's fix him. Hello, Tommy. We have
Hi.
all right, I like it. Cozy group today. All right, good stuff. All right, so howdy, Yoram. Thanks for coming by. All right, so let me share the Miro board with you. It should be a no stranger board to many of you. We're gonna repurpose the board that we've used up until now for all these different, the retros we've had in the past, and we're just continuing with this Miro board as well. So we've used it for accountability workshops in the past and things like that. And hopefully you're seeing the actual Miro board there. So that's where you should be landing. So I put the giant sticky here just in case it's not anchored and you're looking for some of the other stuff. So if you're curious, all the other things were like, when we talk about challenge themes and retros and accountability meetings and stuff like that. So all the cool stuff we've been doing together, or things like, the accountability proof of achievement workshops and all kinds of other public meetings. So it's there. We're going to operate mostly today from here underneath this giant sticky.
Asking for a password.
Is it? Can you try password?
I think it's just Catalyst lowercase.
Is it? Or Catalyst? Okay,
Yeah.
try that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.
It's as effective as password.
It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, good stuff. So as I mentioned, there's a bunch of other boards that you can check out later on if you are interested from the historical perspective, but mostly we're planning to operate from this one here specifically today. Now, we have a bit of in terms of timing, looking to basically go through the 90 minutes that we have. Obviously, we have a bit of a warm-up here in the beginning where we have 2 key objectives that we would like to cycle through and see whether we can make some good development today on, and initially setting the context, then have a bit of a self-work through using the stickies, and then we have a discussion about 20 minutes for each of those segments. Hopefully that should sort of like give us a bit of a time management expectations in terms of like what we may be able to cover today. Now, because of the nature of how these things go, very often we're going to come up with all kinds of really cool ideas. And even if something springs to your mind, and it may not be directly or indirectly related to whatever we're talking today about, there's this parking lot on the side. So, if you have some great ideas that we should revisit later that we may not have time today or at some point in the future, and you get inspired as you get listening or the debate or the discussion we'll be having today, drop a sticky here on the side and let's make sure we capture it so that we can also allow ourselves to keep the main board with the focus today. As such, hopefully everybody knows like the purpose of today's workshop. Ideally, what we're trying to do is, as we've signaled since March or like earlier part of this year, there is a need to finalize the categorization and scope of Fund 11. And just to level set, like this is going to be the first iteration for Fund 11. We're going to learn things based on what we find out on how it actually performs in production and actually in a live round. And based on that, we're going to, again, tweak it or further iterate it for Fund 12 or Fund 13 below as well. So further iterations are going to be expected. The goal of of today is not to get it perfect, but to get a meaningful improvement from Fund 10, knowing that we don't have a challenge setting available to us in a current round, and that we're moving into a simplification of the entire user experience as well, and essentially moving into the categorizations. I'd like to propose on basically two main workshop objectives today. First one, we would like to begin basically having a conversation about can we actually validate the main framework? We did instill a couple of options in terms of like how those main categories could look like. They're highlighted here on the board. Whether it's are these the right 4 top levels? We can chat about why yes or why not. And then we can also discuss about once we get to the discussion part of like what would be out of scope, what is, or like how do we actually determine the scope, how it could be enforced, because that is tightly very much intertwined with the challenge briefs as such, and we know that's quite important. And then the second objective would be, once we move to the second part, is double clicking on one of these categories, being conscious of the bandwidth today. So can we double click on something like a product development out of these 4, and what kind of framework can we instill under this category for Fund 11 challenge category as such? So like, what could be different pathways, small cats, big cats, what kind of projects could be, what are the classifications, what are the boundaries and things of that nature. So that's the second half of this meeting today, where we're gonna basically double click based on first, what are the top 4 levels? Are these right? Could there be more and whatnot? And then we're going to take this as an example, first example, and double click in the second half. So we're not going to double click too much on the others, again, just because of the constraints of the time, and so that we remain focused on today's session as such. So I'd be curious to know whether this sounds like a good plan to begin with before we actually proceed, or if you have any doubts or questions before we start, and whether this sounds like a good plan to begin with. So what do you reckon? I see thumbs up from Christina.
Maybe the only other thing to add is that, we need, because of the time, we just want to make sure that we stay really on topic and just keep it to this discussion and these objectives. And then, we can reserve a couple of minutes at the end to make sure that if there are other topics that we need to slate for other workshops, that we capture.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right.
I might add that this is on topic for sure for the directions that I was thinking we had the biggest questions to answer. And I agree, we probably can't answer all the questions right away. But this might be a very good start. And I'd like to see us really capture how the questions that we need to keep asking and getting it to a broader group.
Right, sounds good. Then again, if anything would be out or something we don't catch along this time around, there's definitely a parking lot. I see somebody already getting inspiration from elsewhere. If there's something that you have as a bank of knowledge that we can reference and everybody else will benefit from as well, again, feel free to leverage that, and everybody can also check it out. All right, good stuff. So that's essentially for the start. So I think we can begin. Essentially, I think it comes up. The leading question to begin with, as you know, we've introduced the intention to move from this sporadic challenge setting into the top level categorization. And when we were rethinking and looking at what those look like, these are basically a top 4 that came to mind, knowing about how all the challenges and basically all the proposals have been submitted in the past. They would have sort of fell within the scope of any of these categories. So I think the first question comes out, are these the right 4? Is there some room for an additional ones? Is this too many? Is this too little? And I would invite everybody to start posting the stickies, which are basically here on the bottom. Just grab a sticky and start sort of like chiming in your thoughts as you go around it, whether you feel this is good, what are the gaps. As Lloyd mentioned, there may be some questions that sprinkle to your mind as you're looking at these, and we iterate through it. So we're going to give it 10 minutes. So it's about 45 mark. So at 50, we can commence the discussion if that's good to go.
Is there any color coding or just any?
Currently no color coding, so it's just, some people may like these or that. Feel free to choose any. Awesome. I see, Jeremy, your comment in it. Feel free, if you are able to make some edits, to transpose it as a sticky as well, or if you're unable to edit or access, just let me know and I can also create a sticky out of it. Oh, I see on there. Perfect. And I think I just admitted somebody in the room. I don't see the mic, so I'm not sure if they can. There they are. Hello, Anna. Just to reorient you in the room, we're currently working out of the Miro board. Let me reshare the link, whereas the password should be Catalyst, simply lowercase Catalyst. And we're splitting the conversation today in two halves. The first one is talking about the high-level categorization for Fund 11. What could that look like? There is some proposed framework, but we're trying to identify what are their gaps, opportunities, things that we need to consider. Is this enough? Is this sufficient? Or do we need to think about other elements that are not represented here? And then we're going to double click on one specific category, perhaps the product development or the use cases specifically, and see what we come up with there.
I cannot find where to raise hands, so I'll just shout. There's a couple of notes already regarding the categories that are named the same that were in Fund 10. So maybe a bit of clarification. Are these the same, or is this?
So is it with regard to what was presented as the initial framework during the town halls when we talked about categorization?
I mean, Catalyst Open and system improvements have been in Fund 10.
Yes.
So are we to think of them as the same as they have been now in Fund 10, or is this something entirely new?
I think more the question is like, if we were going to change them, how would they change?
Yeah. Yeah, the proposal here, or the hypothesis, the assumption is that if Fund 11 were to start tomorrow, would these four categories be the right ones to begin with, knowing what we know today? And if not, why not? And if yes, what yes? And if there are any gaps, what do we need to account for, essentially? Does this cover the breadth and the variety of the ecosystem? Is this enough to ensure that there is a space for everybody in terms of the sheer support of the innovation and the scope of the catalyst as such? Things of that nature. Yoram, your hand is up. Go for it. And just heads up, we have about 3 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes left on the work on the board before we start discussion as well. Yoram?
I have a question. We must be one step before, and I don't want to confuse in the process, and we have limited time. But what's the goal of Project Catalyst? It might be different goal for different people, and because that will then define also the categories. But yeah, I don't know if it will be too confusing, but
really great point.
No, it's a really good point. Okay, let me start with that.
yeah, because I think for different people still today, it will mean different. They will get different answers. And Fund 10 shows that as well.
Yeah, we have about 1 minute or no, 44 we started. Apologies, we said 55. Okay, 5 more minutes.
And once we do land on the correct 4 or 5 or whatever categories, they should be very well defined, and they should answer certain questions like, what are we about to solve with these?
Yeah, so I don't think we'll be able to nail down entirely the scope or the brief of it, but it's absolutely something that we need to think about. How do we ensure that people submitting under these categories have an understanding of challenges we've seen in terms of what is in scope, what is not, and how do we define and narrow it so there's less confusion and less interpretation, and it's much easier to navigate for all the participants how those elements fit within those categories.
And let me just also be really clear, guys. So like the little bullets or the where it says killer dApps, integrations, DevX, or ecosystem events, education, like these are sort of just, you know, high level areas of interest more than anything. Not to say that this is only what would be the focus, and the opportunity today and subsequent sessions will be to refine what are these focuses and these areas of interest. So, you know, I'm seeing, I mean, we'll get into the discussion soon, but marketing and onboarding, yeah, absolutely. I would consider that to be as part of ecosystem expansion, probably sitting somewhere between events, education, and content.
Yes, and this is where the challenge briefs are going to become very crucial. Once we know that these are the right buckets, at least thematically, if they make sense, we start looking into like, okay, what those thematic blocks are, what is the focus, so that people actually reading it have a good grasp of like, are they in the right place? Are they doing the right thing, essentially, in terms of participating in the right place?
Can I ask, who are visiting makers and visiting visionaries?
Probably if you don't have, it depends if you don't have an account,
Yeah,
it
Just
will
wondering
probably
if-
give you like a
someone we know.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yes, people from the call, I would imagine.
Yeah, just wondering who.
It did take me a minute to get logged in, so that might be the issue. You can't be here anonymously, and it took me a minute to actually get logged in.
I see. Okay, so it could be you, Lloyd. It could
Yeah, I think I'm one of them, but because I didn't log in, so yeah.
be. No worries. Awesome.
Yeah,
And
it's
who was
probably
that?
Rafa and Tommy.
Oh, Raf.
them.
Thanks, Rafa. Who, Tommy? Oh yeah, I don't see Tommy's name there, so that would make sense. Okay, Danny, do you want to take us forward?
Yeah, we have 2 minutes left, but
Oh, is it? I thought it was 1 minute a couple of minutes ago. Okay, good.
yeah, it's we started at 44, I think. So just to, but I think the activity has slowed down, so I think we can slightly begin. If there's any volunteer that would like to begin and start to kick us off.
So can we use the whole time? I need more time.
Yes, absolutely. There's a good question here about the budget. It probably we won't have time today to dive into the budgets question, just to set the expectation a little bit. It's also a big rabbit hole that I think we can spend a lot of time diverging into. So if that's okay, I'll keep that, but I'll put it, okay, maybe not into the parking lot, but I'll put it here on the side as a note.
Yeah, I think it's fair that note that I added there just now about the catalyst in regards to Voltaire. I think it's the same thing. I just wanted to capture it, but I don't think it's part of today's discussion. I think it's something that we have to keep in mind, that Voltaire is going to change the funding landscape in Cardano as well, right? So not everything is going to be a catalyst funding thing any longer, because it's not going to be the only means for funding. So I do we need to understand how we exist in that new space. It's a year away, but we need to understand it and prepare for it. So
yeah, that makes sense. And it's essentially, when you think of it, I think because it is year out, I think it's fair to say that we're going to be covering for a lot of, exclusively in the ecosystem funding as in terms of coverage. So I would imagine as we get closer and there's a clarity in terms of when the Voltaire comes online specifically, that we can start basically, having those interest buckets separated of clearly who is responsible for what, because Voltaire will be encompassing everything. And then you may have things like Intersect and MBOs and Catalyst. And I think that ties also, for the time being, we still, intend for the Catalyst to be the grassroots incubator for innovation in Cardano. But understanding that this is the only faucet for the treasury for the time being until we get full-fledged Voltaire rollout as such. So that's definitely a big parking lot item for sure.
Yeah, so that's it. I just wanted to capture it for now. It's definitely not today's discussion. My brain will forget it, so I wanted to write it down.
Super. Where do you have that sticky? Let's put it here down. Super. On the bottom. So we know we can separate the intent today. Okay, awesome. Tommy, how are you feeling? Ready to go?
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. All right, so is there anyone who would like to kick off with any of these stickies that you put on, and let's try to get through some of them. Maybe even better, what would be interesting is, as we get through the discussion, there's actually, because there's quite a few stickies here as well, there are a couple of green dots on the left. If you were to choose 3 top topics that you would like to discuss, if you can grab 3 stickies.
Before that, can we just read through all of them?
Yes.
Like aloud.
Okay, yeah, we can do that. All right, so I'll start on the top. So as I'm reading through it, please try to drag the stickies and see which one seem in the sense of importance to you. Just take basically 3 stickies and then point them as we go through them as the most important one in your mind, just so that we get a sense of where's the clustering in terms of the interest and where we should focus our attention as we go through. All right, here it is. For the product development, there's a sticky that talks about needs to be super clear that the solutions we are after should be relevant in society, not just inside the bubble. It's a fair comment. I think as I'm going to read another one, it'd be great to clarify what is the meaning of the bubble. It has a bit of a broad meaning, and it's probably hard to quantify. Is it within the Cardano ecosystem? Is it within the Catalyst? So just a food for thought there, just to add a little bit of a color. Another one, would product development include improvements to the blockchain itself? For example, pushing development of things like Sancho to the community. So maybe that speaks to the question that Lloyd has mentioned earlier in terms of where the division of responsibilities lie within the age of Voltaire. If that is the case, I'm not sure who posted this sticky, but if you agree with the sentiment that this is a bigger picture in terms of when we start discussing a Voltaire and Intersect, feel free to move the sticky to the parking lot section on the bottom if possible.
Very quickly on that point, that is actually the only other source of funds, not Treasury Direct, but source of funds right now, is the MBO actually does have funding for that specifically right now, and they are issuing grants for that specifically right now. Just
All right, so with permission, I will move it here. We're not leaving it out. We're just sort of reading through the scope a little bit. Then we have developing Cardano versus building on Cardano. So again, it's very much also a relevant question to the before. Education specific to students in universities, fieldwork, educational institutions, data points to a huge adoption factor here. There's a green sticky here as well. I think it very much aligns here. New challenges proposed by the community. So I would assume this talks through the lenses of the challenge setting as we've seen in the past. Maybe a question there, is there room for this model? How could it be maintained? What it would look like? Onboarding here too, I think Chris has touched upon it, that this is very much within the ecosystem expansion as well. Now with Catalyst open, there is a sticky here for Cardano open. I think, and Chris, you might have dropped it here as well, right? It's saying that Catalyst may be too specific and maybe suggesting that this is only for Catalyst, whereas, you know, that's not necessarily true. So a bit of a semantics here, right?
Exactly that.
Yeah, totally agree on that point. That was that's what the check mark next to it's for. Is that's a better, more open way of talking about it.
Awesome. For the Catalyst open, does this modify Catalyst open from the Fund 10 version? Modify, extend, refine, open? Yes, I think that's a fair answer. Basically, everything is on the table. We're trying to figure out what that Fund 11 landscape could look like, given what we've learned in the first iteration of Catalyst open as it comes in. Why should only this category be open source focused? So, you know, that's a big question as well in terms of like, should Catalyst only be funding open source, or is there room for both of these instances for closed source, open source, partially focused on it? So that's probably also a bigger question that we can also tackle. I believe there are main categories we should consider. However, I've noticed some projects this fund seeking for getting legal clarification or legal support. Not sure if it's worth category, but in case if it is an open Catalyst, I believe open Catalyst requirements should change. So fund seeking for getting legal clarifications, that could be maybe part, I'm thinking, you know, whether this is part of education, possibly setting standards, right? Like ecosystem standards and things of that nature. Catalyst system improvements here. There's a decision-making, voting process improvement. In this context, how is Catalyst defined? Is it about Catalyst system as it is today, or is it about creating innovation funds in general and improving how we do that? That's a relevant question, because that basically helps narrow down the scope very much so, and helps people basically fine-tune them, the proposals for a specific purpose. Can we separate between the process related and the innovation itself and have different terms for categories accordingly? Would be great for this sticky maybe to introduce two potential definitions to understand how the original thought lays out here, just so that we know what's the difference.
Yeah, I can speak to that. It's my sticky.
Okay.
So
awesome.
I mean, the idea is again is what's the goal of Catalyst in general. So I see it as an innovation fund, right? So you have the process of how you enable an innovation fund, and then you have the funding for the innovation fund themselves. And then how much you want to also, you know, onboarding also is kind of the innovation ecosystem. You have onboarding, then you have the process of the innovation, all of that, and then you have investing in innovation, which is DApp and integration or infrastructure or whatever it is. Yeah, so I'm just, in my mind, it's separated, and today it's all together somehow. And I think that's confusing, and yeah, that is in my mind. And there could be different, just like we actually, it was now, for the Catalyst operation, there was different terms, right? It has to be for 1 year, there are different terms for that. But for the process one can be different terms than the innovation one. Yeah, that's
all right, that's good.
That's the way I imagine.
It's fair enough. Then there's this category has been problematic in Fund 10. Is it the same definition process or something else? So I think that speaks to need to refine the scope and the challenge brief so that we can avoid rough fitters late in the process to ensure that these things are, because essentially that's very specific to Catalyst tech stack and processes, essentially that it makes that it's implementable and it advances the state of the art of the Catalyst. So that brief likely needs their work. So that's a fair comment. IOG should not be able to move things around at will. That's also IOGs that can be also replaced with operator, anyone who actually essentially runs the Catalyst, like what are the separation of the concerns and where we are where there are opportunities to ensure there is a clear role of the engagement, essentially. So very fair comment, and I think we've seen it in Fund10 as well. All right, make this entire thingy better. Would be good to clarify in a sticky what it means in terms of thingy. The 4 categories seem to be about build stuff, research stuff, grow ecosystem, and then governance. It's also a good thought.
So I added to someone else that make this entire thingy better. So those 4 and then make it better.
Yeah, awesome. As the thought is fantastic. It helps to think about like which of these things are going to make this entire thing better, right? So that we can be making the dial towards those objectives. Another framework for viewing this maintenance versus development. I think that's also important. Maybe this is where the distinction between maybe the operator duties versus development duties is where is the maintenance accounted for, things of that nature. I think that is something to double click. Does catalyst management still need a separate category? So not immediately in funds 11 and 12, because it will be an annual term, but soon enough there would need to be again. And then we would need to discuss what is the right time frame in terms of ensuring that there is actually no ruptures between the terms and there is a crossover in a way that there is a comfortable handover and there is no challenges in terms of like a hard stop and hard start, but it's more of a crossover. So
perfect. Yeah, that was mine that I brought in, and I just moved it over there because that it kind of fits in with these other things. But that's exactly it. It's the we need a form of continuity. We've already seen what happens with roughly year break. This is what happens, and we have this huge grasp of going after this funding now. So what can we do to ensure the operations continue even if the operator changes?
Absolutely. And then what is the status of Catalyst operations for Fund 11? So I guess that's coupled together essentially so there wouldn't be in Fund 11, it would be targeted on an annual basis. The question remains open, when is the right time to introduce it back into the mix so that there is that, business continuity, if you will, in terms of the operational viability.
And quickly, Danny, someone made some movements around. I had written, do we accomplish the MISC category that captures other things we aren't thinking of? And someone moved that up to Catalyst Open. So I just wanted to point that one out as well.
Yeah, it's fair enough. I think essentially that's where the MISC was sort of like Catalyst Open / Cardano Open was taking the spirit of the MISC to ensure that things which may be odd or not fitting in the other categories could account for themselves to be in a Catalyst Open. That's where the original analysis and research of all of the proposals throughout the 9 funding cycles were essentially falling within the realm of 3 to 4 categories essentially that helps them to find the home. So you're not blocked.
So perhaps this will be for more of the scoping of that category itself, but I just want to make sure that it didn't fit elsewhere is part of the language of Cardano Open's category whenever it gets finalized. If that's the home of MISC, that's great. The spirit and the letter have to both be there. And I think right now I don't see the letter of everything that get caught in that description there.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say also that we probably should get comfortable with the fact that we cannot account for everything, which I think the goal of the MISC was in the first place. And once we get comfortable that it's okay to maybe make some, misses on the fringes in terms of like trying to get as much in as possible, just so that it doesn't, bulk up the system altogether, trying to catch all those edge cases, because then it becomes also costly to the process and essentially how we flow through it.
Fair enough.
Is there a process for when a proposal is put in the wrong category? Is there any recourse if the proposer disagrees? That's also a good big question. I would suggest also that one is sort of like for later, that basically speaks to once we actually figure out what the scope of those categories and the right categories are, in the next session, we could be talking about how do we actually make movements between them, or what are the changes within. So, and just from top of my mind, and do we need to define catalyst incentive rewards at the same time? I think that would be also out of today's scope specifically, but also definitely something worth reading as such. Did we read through most of these stickies? Is there anything that anyone would like to add on, or?
Yeah, for me, the percentage also, what's the decision of the percentage per category? Also,
so and today we won't be able to crack that down. I'm really focusing today on what those
The
buckets
categories.
are and what do we
Okay.
fit them in, so that we can, because once we have those buckets, we can start assigning values to them. But I don't think we'll be able to cover that today. But I think it's captured in right here on the sticky. What is the budget for each category? So we're not going to lose the sight of it.
In this point in the ecosystem, I'm conscious that the Catalyst team has similar characteristics of many of us in this ecosystem. We are not different from us trying to work with the resources at disposition. And that's clear for me and many others in the ecosystem. And I try to understand this consolidation of lines, business lines in some way. Could I ask why, in your opinion, why this consolidation of categories? Because in the past, we had some variety and many
Yeah.
many other options.
I mean, maybe I can give a little bit of context there. if it's useful.
But I'm not thinking this in terms of okay, you are IOG and I'm independent. No, it's not, because as I said before, we have the same pains in this moment and a long time ago. So, but okay, that's it.
Maybe just to kind of give a bit of context, certainly there seems to have been a lot of discussion and debate within the community as to how do we make sure that there's recursive or continuous opportunities for people's project proposals to sit within clearly one of the categories or challenges. And there seems to have been a number of occasions where we haven't been able to really as a community fulfill that because of the change from one challenge to the next, from one fund to the next. And yeah, certainly the open category in Fund 10 and MISC prior to that was a part of the solution. But again, if you're a new user or potential proposer, or you're not just a one-man band, you're like a professional firm, or you're a university, or whoever it might be, coming to look at Catalyst for the very first time with all these different challenges, and then them changing one fund to the next, it makes it difficult to understand where your efforts are best made. And unless you're privy or very closely following Catalyst, you might not pick up that challenges change from one fund to the next. So you might miss the window of opportunity to propose in one round, getting excited for the next, and only to be met with challenges that aren't within the scope of what your proposal is. Now that's on one hand. On the other hand, with the challenges that change from fund to fund, there's very limited accountability on those outcomes. And certainly challenge teams, again, have been part of the solution, but I don't think it's necessarily solved. So, the idea of being able to maybe consolidate is an opportunity to streamline the onboarding experience, as well as also to fix on some very clear and broadly defined scopes that doesn't mean that I'm, as a user, trying to navigate and interpret and understand a dozen or more challenges, but there's a clear set of a clear small number of buckets or themes or areas of interest that I can anchor into. That was the idea. That's been some of the idea behind it. That, and the fact that what we've certainly seen is there's some negatives and some drawbacks and trade-offs when you've got all these challenges, because everybody's spending a lot of effort to make sure the challenges are successful or voted for, and maybe that time, effort, energy, and cost will be better spent if it was just focusing in on developing use cases and proposals and outcomes that sit within a smaller number of well-defined objectives.
I still don't know how to raise my hand, so can I add something?
Sure, please.
One of the early ideas was also that when the funding comes in periodically or whatever, it is channeled in a balanced way. And that's why we started using tools like the Balanced Scorecard from the world of business, where you don't just like put all of the eggs in one basket. You don't just support ideas and innovations that are in the financial perspective, or you don't only support ideas that are in the customer perspective or the internal process perspective or the learning perspective. So the idea would be that when you have the clear categories, then it is supporting your strategy that you are in a balanced way, putting funding in all of these and not just one of them.
In terms of, say, like budget weighted towards the different categories, Tommy, is that what you mean?
Yeah, so like if you would ask person X, they might say that, okay, I want to focus only on product development. And if you ask person Y, they might say that I want to only focus on culture and whatnot. So when you have the categories defined, then you ensure that it's a strategic decision that you put certain amount or certain percentage at least into those categories that you have defined.
Got it. Understood. Yeah, and that how to allocate and apportion budget or budget weighting, certainly something that we'll cover in a later session for sure.
Awesome, thank you, Tommy. Chris. All right, so what I'd like to do is maybe take it also from another end as a wrap up for this segment, so we can pause it for a minute and maybe start double clicking towards one of those. I'll reverse the question the other way around. Is there something on your mind that would seemingly be not covered by these 4 categories when you're thinking about a Project Catalyst in the next funding cycle, right? Because we're going to iterate each funding cycle as such. What would that be that you're not seeing here? What is the gap?
When I saw that the first time, I was like, yeah, this covers pretty much everything. Good, let's go. But now I started doubting myself. So on the right side, those blue post-its that I suggested as a, no, on the right side, if you pull to the right side out of this picture.
So for example, like this one, like the ecosystem is vague. You're saying there could be a Catalyst expansion. Maybe I would make an argument, could Cardano expansion be a thing, right? In a similar way as we're talking about the Catalyst Open, just as
Actually, Danny, he's talking, there's some large blue stickies down to the right.
Ah, gotcha.
There's 4 big
Apologies.
ones.
There we go.
Try to make it visible.
Got it.
Thanks, Lloyd. Yeah, so I'm not saying that they should be these. I'm just giving food for thought. Like, should we rename, reframe to make sure that they are super clear? Because, for example, catalyst system improvements and ecosystem expansion might sound similar to some.
Yeah, and I think this is where clarity of the scope for catalyst systems improvement specifically is fundamental, right? Because that's sort of sandbox just for the catalyst use case, right? Like if you're thinking about Project Catalyst as a self-sustaining engine, this is the category that basically helps curate tooling, services, upgrading, essentially making sure that the machinery is well oiled and it has everything that it needs to actually transcend over the period of time. Whereas other 3 categories are basically swimming over the course of Cardano ecosystem as such. So I think that that's the major difference between the Catalyst system improvements and any of the others, that Catalyst systems improvements and by extension Catalyst fund operations are zoned in with the scope only within the Catalyst ecosystem as such, and they're locked into that scope. If they are by proxy helping some other things within the ecosystem because they can be reused, so be it, but the primary driver is to improve the tooling and processes directly within the Catalyst.
Yeah, I'm sorry again to be coming a bit backward. I mean, for me, it's very tough to say before understanding like what's the goal of Catalyst and how the money is going to be distributed. For example, Catalyst Open, if it does get 25% as a category, then we say, okay, everything that doesn't fit anywhere, we just throw there, and it's 25%. That, for example, doesn't make sense, right? If Catalyst Open is 5% or 10% of the budget, okay, then okay, it's a category for itself.
I
I'm
think
just
it
giving
should,
an example, but yeah.
sorry,
But what's
Yoram,
the-
I think
yeah, sorry.
I think the idea with Catalyst MISC or Open has been since the get-go that it's like this thing that defends the open innovation and anything goes idea. So maybe I don't know what the budget will be, but maybe it would be like 30, 30, 30, 10. So then the 10% would go to Catalyst Open.
Yeah, and I think we can. I definitely see where you're going with it, Yoram, and I think maybe a bit of a clarity might come out to see from the next exercise where we're trying to see what those different tracks are, because I think that opens up the mind in terms of like, okay, where different size shapes of kinds of projects and focus are going to be nested under, right? Like, should there be different tracks? So once you start understanding, maybe if we have a different tracks underneath of those big categories, it makes it easier then to understand what could be the scope of the Catalyst Open, as not necessarily that it needs to account for everything, because there may be actually a room for all the others categories as such, and then really just something that is crazy out of the left field or things that really don't necessarily fit into others that could be housed under the Catalyst Open.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the 4 categories now and thinking about Fund 10. Look at what percentage of the requests were in the one that would now be covered under product development. Like we had multiple categories that are now encompassed in product development. That would be OSDE, that would be products and integrations, that would be development and infrastructure. Those were the biggest, most sought after categories that had the largest overruns of requests as well, right? So all of that huge activity is now going to be in one category. And now, yes, we're adding back stuff that we didn't have, because I know I've strongly felt the missing of that ecosystem expansion area. It has not been there for a couple of funds now, right? 9 and 10 really had a lack of those. So that's going to be super important as well, because it invigorates a whole other part of the ecosystem that's got no love for a while. But you know, I'm looking at it kind of from that perspective of, wow, there's a lot that's going to fall under product development now. Like, and it's the lion's share of the last 2 funds went there, and there's still an appetite for more.
Let me just add one thing, please. I think it's perfectly done. Reply by Danny. Sorry to stop you.
No, go for it, because I think it will be a really nice segue of like, because understanding that this is going to be a massive category potentially in terms of like the scope, that I think once we start now double clicking in a minute or two of like what those segmentation, so that we can take the big chunk and we can actually segment it more meaningfully. But Yoram, finish your thoughts.
So and also again, do we want to finance a lot of projects up to 100,000 per company? Okay, or do we want companies to be able to raise $1 million over the fund? Okay, because if that, maybe we need to separate the Catalyst funded product and services to 2: acceleration phase, say 30% of the fund, innovation phase, like early stage, 30% of the fund. And like what I'm saying is the key of Project Catalyst, at least from my understanding, is innovation ecosystem, right? Today we are mixing together newcomers, successful companies, right? Taking most of the funds from Fund 10, probably 90% of the fund, I assume, just like this. And so you don't have anything for the rest, right? If that's the objective of Project Catalyst, perfect. We meet the objective, successful companies on Cardano raising more money. Great. If this is not the objective, I think it has to be somehow described in the categories and in the process. And this is why, look, we're after Fund 10 with a lot of understanding there, and after Fund 9 and 8, as Dylan said. And so we need to understand what's the objective.
Yeah, I think that's a really...
and there the role of the community in that. If we need to onboard many new companies, the community play a different role in them supporting some big companies, right, in the ecosystem. Just putting it out there.
Yeah, and that is a really, really good segue into the next part of the session, really. Should we go there, Danny?
Yeah, let's do it. Again, obviously, great discussion. Sorry, Yoram, you wanted something?
Yeah, and I'm not saying what's right or wrong. It's not my decision. I'm just saying we need to be clear on that.
We
right?
are just talking heads here today, trying to figure out what makes sense and sort of like get a bit of a sense of like in a direction we could go. So I think it's a great discussion so far. Again, everything, if things come up related to just things we've been talking about, feel free to drop the stickies so we don't lose any of that amazing insights. That, as Chris said, this is a perfect segue of what Lloyd and Yoram were just discussing, because it is evident that there is a need of some sort of segmentation. We're seeing, one big arena of projects competing for people's attention, understanding, and also resources, whereas, all of them are arguably in all these different stages of readiness in terms of like where they're coming in, what they're trying to do, and essentially where they're trying to go. So our initial thought as we were looking at all of the discussion and everything we've been seeing is, what could that look like, for example, under this category for product development? This is not to say that this needs to be exactly replicated for all the other categories, but it's a start. And if we can figure out what that framework could look like for product development, maybe something will rhyme for the others down the line as well. And maybe some categories don't need it as such, but we'll cross that bridge once we get through it. So we basically laid out here 3 segments. First one is sort of talking about ideas, where we're talking about proof of concept. So as written here, things like basic prototyping, a white paper, early validation, design, research, things of that nature. Such idea would have a very hard time competing in a place for an established project to resurface, however great that may be, when there's big projects looking for other segments like acceleration, when you have like big players trying to amplify, existing solutions or just build upon it. So again, this would probably have a certain threshold in terms of funding. We could again discuss what that could be, what would be an appropriate levels, like when or how much would it take, for ideas to be involved with, and then sort of making essentially a step up into the innovation, where we're moving away from a proof of concept to the actually ability to convert from proof of concept to actually reach the MVP. Have any prototypes already been developed? Are we able to push that dial further? Has there some proof of concept been already done that it's ready to take it to the next level? Or where we have it mentioned here, deployment into the testnet. Has any real world testing been done? What are the features, innovation of the audits and things of that nature, which probably could, have a step up in terms of the framework, has basically something has been already developed here, right? It's not a brand new innovation not a brand new idea or funded proposals. And then a last one, acceleration, maybe thinking through of like, this is where the projects are seeking to scale their solutions, maybe add advanced features, capabilities to something they've already established that, okay, this works. How can we take it to the next level? Something that allows us to actually meaningfully talk about, okay, is it moving the dial on transactions? Is it improving the user base, onboarding people into the ecosystem? What does that look like? What does the growth pattern look like in terms of accelerating these projects? And there's a suggestion that perhaps in order for Project Catalyst for you to be asking to accelerate your existing efforts, maybe you must have had completed project in the past, right? So maybe that sort of, again, separates in terms of concern as things go forward. So these are basically 3 levels. So when we talk about you can talk about ideas as a small cats, innovation as a medium cat, and then acceleration, a big cat, or innovation acceleration, a big cats, and categories and ideas as small cats. So this is the thought framework that we were thinking through. And if there's anything that's inspired you, start dropping the stickies if you haven't already, and let's have a look. So feel free to take next, since we already started 5 minutes or so, let's give it another 15 minutes, see where we are. And then let's spend the rest of the the session today, chatting about this.
And you know, just as a bit of an idea, the way that I can imagine this is that rather than, you know, it being so to answer the question around how is it being tagged, I could imagine as a proposer, you're going to propose into an ideas bucket or the innovation bucket or the acceleration bucket, rather than you're just putting into product development and then somehow it gets sorted into one of the three. It's more like it's a choice being made by the proposer as to where, what stage of readiness are they? What stage of maturity are they?
So this basically answers Yoram's question that the big finalized products are never going to compete against the budding grassroots ideas, right?
Yeah, that, I mean, and that's the idea here, really. Like, how do we make sure that this feels inclusive and or remains inclusive without it being so loose that, you know, we encounter the same issues that we've seen, or concerns that, you know, the most mature, well-known projects swoop up almost all of the funding. And I would argue that's not strictly the case. We still see so many projects that are funded that are first-time proposers or really early stage. But, you know, how do we improve that process? How do we make it really clear? And
I think
with the confidence to spend the time putting effort into cooking up brand new ideas for proof of concept.
And I think where this also gets interesting, that when also we are collectively presenting choices to voters and decision makers, it also allows people to place what they're looking at in a better contextual frame. Whereas having just one giant bucket where there's all these varieties from zero to hero, from left and right, having ability as a voter come in and look through these, these different categorizations, you start understanding, like, what is the context of what I'm looking at, the ideas that I'm reading about. Are there moonshots? Are there ideas? You know, is this something completely new? Are these teams that have been maybe already vetted or funded in the past? Have they a track record and things of that nature? So that we can start basically separating the interest more visibly, and arguably should help the dial on that decision making as well, because you provide the context for people to start making decision and basically flow within the framework, whereas having everything in one place. Even today, as we see it, we have the categories as we have them today, but it's very challenging for anyone from the get-go to understand on, like, what is the readiness level. You know, we see proposals from each direction, every shape or form, but unless you really spend a very extended amount of time, it's hard to start segmenting that from the top quickly. So this could help. And I think ultimately this exercise, what will allow us is to communicate clear the intent of who or what proposes inside the catalyst, and in theory should also mitigate a lot of that confusion, and in many cases almost small fights in terms of, like, oh, this should be here, this shouldn't be there. Like, you guys are not here, you guys should be elsewhere, and things of that nature. That the better these categories and tracks are defined, less of a room for for fighting over the resources. between the players that are on an uneven ground, essentially.
Sorry, that's a bit of a book, so it looks rather large there, but it's just an idea of using a form of certification, thinking like the MBO. It's open to all. It's not like gatekeep. Anyone can go in, anyone can perform the actions, do the work, and then it kind of this is how you gate access to those things, but it's not gate kept by a human. It's the idea that you go through, complete some set of processes, and if you do, you get access to higher levels of funding. And there could be a number of ways you could do it, and the requirements would obviously be much lesser, if any at all, for the very basic POC categories, but much more stringent as you go along.
Yeah, essentially, there is a higher threshold to meet as you try to progress for more funding, essentially, or try to unlock the category where it has a lot more funding available.
That's right. That's right. It kind of, not to pick on any names, because I just won't do that, but there were stuff in last round and stuff in this round that's like asking for millions of dollars. Never heard of the guy.
Yeah.
And the community really hates that. They really hate that. So we might be able to eliminate some of that with something as simple as this. And this is good enough for the MBO. Maybe it's good enough for us. Maybe if we can define this in a way, it might work. Anyways, and so it's a book there, but that's why it's so big.
Oh, hang on. Where's the book, Lloyd? Is it the big?
Yeah, the big
giant green sticky at the bottom.
Yeah.
I thought it was an actual book. Okay, no, I see. Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think it's an interesting idea. Like, if you've completed a project, we've got the receipts on that, right? It could be as simple as an NFT, or even as simple as just like, you've got a pass to then apply into the next category, right, or the next tier. And yeah, I think part of the reason is you guys have articulated really well for thinking through this from a segmenting and tiers perspective, is to be able to slow down the throughput of brand new proposers just slinging as much spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. If and there's other simple ways that you could do that. I mean, we could put in a limit on how many proposals any one lead or co-proposer can be party to in a round, right, or in a category. To me, that makes lots of sense. There are trade-offs with that approach as well, right? You potentially push people into the shadows. So, proposer X buddies up with proposer D, who's never been party to Catalyst before. Proposer X has already chucked in his proposals, so he gets the other person to put it in them for themselves. Obviously, some things would come out in the wash eventually, but these are set. And then I appreciate that things like SSI or credentialing in some sort of way is a solution again, but we're still not there yet. And these are all just what can we do with the lowest barrier to entry to get something of this stood up in Fund 11 that serves our needs, but we acknowledge it's still an iterative solution.
For sure, definitely.
And this is also like a direction in terms of like in one of the Catalyst systems improvements proposals, the Voices talks about role-based access, where we're not only thinking about, okay, the only people who are currently verified and logged into the system are essentially the voters through their on-chain registrations, but like how do we extend that across a variety of all the other roles? And then essentially that basically unlocks you the access, verified credentials, things of like you mentioned, it would be easy then for a role that has an access defined that must meet the certain requirements, maybe holding a couple of NFTs or something of that serves as a certification that unlocks innovation or unlocks the acceleration, and we're able to automate. But obviously it's still ahead of us in terms of like whether it gets the endorsement and then also building it out. But that's generally like a direction of like, how can we automate a lot of those things and then figure out how to add those pieces so that we can leverage things like VCs and DIDs and help flow through the system without adding a lot of bureaucratic overhead, because that's also associated and with added cost and resource needed.
Absolutely. And I can see a future where having these NFTs in your wallet and then you going for VC funding from some organization that's, you know, that's in the ecosystem would be very helpful, right? Where, hey, I went through this with Catalyst, it's provable, it's here, and we're on to the next step. So yeah, it has value that even exists outside of Catalyst once you've gone through the process.
Can I bring some perspective outside of this conversation?
Go for it.
Are you done with this? Okay. So I dropped some stuff in the whatever pile of stuff. What is it called? The that parking lot. So the first thing is that it's not only about funding, that there's a lot of stuff that we're doing here.
Yep.
So those are the things that any open innovation platform should actually do. And funding is just one of those things. And then the other thing is that when we are categorizing or tagging, we want to achieve certain outcome. And this conversation started from making sure that we have a balanced approach and we don't endanger some smaller ideas on the altar of grand companies fighting for millions. But there are other ways of categorizing, and we should always like make sure that we use the right type of categories and we know why we are doing it. I'm not saying what they should be, but I just want us to be mindful of choosing the kind of categories that drive the kind of action that we want to see in the ecosystem. And then tagging is another thing altogether, which has a great benefit of maybe sending notifications to certain people at certain times when certain things are tagged in a certain way. That was a weird way of saying that if I have some insight about X, then when someone has a proposal about X, then I get notified and I get to help that person or that team. So maybe that's the value of tagging. Maybe there are other values that you can see also.
Thanks, Tommy. Really useful insights. Certainly there's been an ambition for the Catalyst website to be able to have like a user profile area where you're able to set up your own sort of tagging preferences, and then you get notifications as changes are made to the platform, but it's not been implemented. And I mean, yeah,
and then it was quite useful what you mentioned before, that certain things should be chosen by the proposer and certain things could be just tagged by the community. So if they see that, okay, this is there, then maybe they should be tagged in a certain way so that they get to form whatever challenge teams or category teams or subcategory teams or whatever. And that's one more thing that I put in the middle of that board, the green post-it, that this helps us to collect like organizational competence or know-how or memory that we can then over time build our competence in these areas and then help people who come later. So that it's no longer about Danny or Lloyd or Joram or Tommy or Chris, but whoever comes later then has this wealth of knowledge, pool of knowledge that has been gathered over the years.
Yeah, one thing I want to say related to what Tommy said, if I understood correctly, also Tommy is, I mean, and also what's the purpose of the fund? Okay, if you look, I mean, in the sense that if you look on So it's not what's the goal of Catalyst, but what's the purpose of the funding themselves, right? So if we look at the objective of CF for this year is education, adoption, and infrastructure, right? So this category, like overreach category for the innovation. And I think that's also an interesting aspect to look at, because then it gives kind of a direction for this, for the blockchain. Yeah, today I was in a conference, crypto conference here in Geneva. Everyone asking me, okay, so how Cardano is unique, right? So, okay, you explain the technology and so on, but it's part of the parameters of which companies are coming to Cardano and why. Just wanted to throw that in as a thought. If we also want to give a direction, a lot of the funds, and you know that well, Chris, I mean, have certain kind of mandate, right, relating to certain subjects.
Mhm.
And if we just keep it open, I think it just create, it just create the biggest variety, and it's tougher to give expertise in certain area. That's a thought. It's not that the pros and cons are going.
Thank you, Yoram. I see Jeremy might have also captured it as a sticky. Shout out to Jeremy. Thank you for catching those thoughts. All right, so what I suggest, maybe we can cycle through some of the additional, I think we've organically done it. We've talked about some of those certifications. What are the pathways? I think we recognize also that there is some technological readiness challenges as such. So we do need to curb our expectations in general, like what is it, the lowest denominator that we can do going into Fund 10. Things we talked about, tagging, Tommy brought that forward. And also I saw these stickies over here, I added a couple of additional thoughts here as Tommy was speaking, how are tags applied, who applies them, how are they validated, and things of that nature. So we make it easier for, as Chris or somebody else was saying also, how do we make it discoverable? Right. And I think, again, this speaks about the long-term direction of like, we want to make sure that the innovation is continuous. That's, again, also where the Catalyst voices come in, so that people can keep on working through things and they don't lose that knowledge, as we have often a rupture fund to fund, and it allows people to keep on working and improving those things. What else? Limiting thresholds. Currently, there is no way to protect this layer from participation of the best established players. Right.
Andy, I just want to pause you just for a second. Folks,
yes, please.
I'm going to have to jump off, unfortunately. I've got to get myself prepped for this Cardano Foundation and L Twitter space in 13 minutes. So
no worries. Thank you, Chris.
Cheers, everyone.
See you, Chris.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Cheers.
Yeah, that's happening at top of the hour. All right, so I think we were going to try to finish at top of the hour as well, as we go through it. Okay, so currently there is no way to protect this layer from the participation of the best established players. That may be worth double clicking also, in a sense of how does that relate towards the new and not yet funded proposers? When we say established players, is it within the context of participation in Catalyst, or
yes,
broadly in the ecosystem?
That's the case, one. Because I'm talking about my experience in the students challenge, where we try to follow the parameters of the person, this Japanese kid that proposed that challenge, and was inevitable to the participation of proposals that were different from the proposed, the purpose of the challenge. So in this case, for example, the challenge was for students of universities, and we saw the participation of people from the ecosystem especially, trying to get some funds from there. After that, I could understand the situation, because with Catalyst, so many people working full-time of the ecosystem have to get those funds in some way, So in the challenge, for example, the max grant was $5,000. It's a minimum amount, but sufficient to 1 or 2 months of work of many working groups in these independent groups of this ecosystem. But the situation is there. you are proposing a ledger where only the new ideas have can apply to that ledger. But in reality is you can protect that and at least currently you can protect that ideation ledger from more experienced players in the ecosystem.
Yeah,
Let's say Payma, let's say Milcomeda, let's say they point to everything that moves in this ecosystem. So is fragile the condition of that kind of ledger, in my experience. Thank you.
Certainly, and that's why right next to it I had written the green sticky that's do we limit established companies from joining at this level. But it's my exact concern, exactly what Sebastian was just pointing out. You know, my team's not going to jump in there. I know we won't. It's not. I'd never stand for it. But that doesn't mean that others don't. And I have also seen that whenever there was a fairly good scope, that the scope wasn't really enforced, and so part of this, and I think maybe the way to capture it now in the short term is a stronger idea of what the challenge team's job is when they get to this point, when they're looking at the scope and looking at the proposals prior to locking in the vote. We've got to start front loading some filters wherever we can. We've got to start front loading some filters. And that is a huge filter that if we can accomplish it, that simply this was the scope and you fell out of scope, so therefore your project's being removed from this area. But that can't happen after it's locked. It's got to, in fairness to the proposers, in fairness to the community, it's got to happen prior to the locking, that, hey, you're going to be moved out of this category. Is there somewhere else you'd like to go? Or are you simply don't qualify to be here?
Absolutely. And I think that everyone is generally in agreement with this. Where it falls short still is catching a breath to making sure there's a bandwidth to deal with it. A lot of those inefficiencies come as an outcome of like a lot that needs to get done, and essentially that where you get the suboptimal outcomes. So that's a great call out. I think there needs to be almost, when I think of it, a discussion and longer discussion in terms of like getting people ability to actually fit, even though you will always get those instances where people will always try to shoehorn it somehow, right? Like what is that essentially dividing line of like, that's good enough, or this is just like asking for it, or things of that nature. And I think having, now that we actually, if we talk about nailing down those top level categories, we can start thinking about teams that they can actually professionalize, so they can actually understand, and that scope evolves over time as it gets learned, and you have that knowledge transfer. Whereas previously with challenge setting, you have very wide variety of expertise and knowledge of people actually having capability. Just being on a challenge team may not guarantee that you may be able to execute well on the objectives of like defining the scope. I mean, and because it may require a different set of skills and people involved. And I think the fact that if we introduce persistent categories, we allow people to professionalize and build that knowledge, so that, over time, fund over fund, we really narrow down the understanding of like what is and what falls outside of the scope, and what isn't, what is within it. Your thoughts? Absolutely. Onboarding corporates where it will fit. Can we double click on it just real quickly?
Yeah, I would mention that. I mean, today we had a call with Chiliz of Socios, a big crypto company in France, and the foundation was also there, and they, trying to onboard them to Cardano for different technology and potential. And so Project Catalyst could be an option to kind of onboard this, even if they are successful companies. Be an option, say, okay, come here, we do some, we're able to help you with some of the initial development, meet the community. It's a good hook in, and we saw it also with Legio and Seedstars and other companies, which then can bring a lot of value to the ecosystems. So yeah,
I think what Lloyd was mentioning before, that you collect these NFTs and then you go elsewhere and say that, look, I've done this in Catalyst. That might actually go with this idea that you have a company that comes and like does something small-ish within the scope of Catalyst and then gains reputation and then has other funding mechanisms to take it further.
Exactly.
Thank you, Tommy. Yes, that is exactly the thinking that I have there, is just, give a path. So even if you want to participate in the ecosystem, this is a good path to prove that you can. Hey, we dropped a proof of concept in, we finished that out for, $3,000, $5,000, whatever it was. We moved it up and we went ahead and wrote the MVP, got it launched. And now we can go and we can get regular funding. And this is actually the exact path Drip Drops is following right now. We got our proof of concept done. We're moving on to a full MVP that's getting funding, and we're out in the real world doing seed funding now. That's where we're headed.
And that's perfect. And that can be, also to onboard corporates in this way. And that's great because they can have the funding for next step. And that's related to another comment that is there, that, why, if you are already a successful company and you already have a product and revenue on the ecosystem and you already got funded on Catalyst, why, in Catalyst itself, is that the right place to come and ask for funding, or should there be another mechanism for funding for you? If you have a great team, successful company, so that's just a thought also.
Yeah, and when you think about it more broadly, it's like when we talk about where do the corporates fit in or such, it depends on the scope, right? Like essentially, where do they want to enter? Like, is this something that we're trying to tying with? And this is essentially where the innovation engine comes in, right? Like you can move fast as a corporate, and you might want to quote unquote outsource it somewhere else and see how fast that can move and unleash that innovation. That's essentially the basic premise of Catalyst, right? Like trying to figure out and turn over lots of ideas in a short period of time and to see like what can we learn from that and then build upon it. So I think that that definitely has a pathway to go through. But again, within different tracks, you would just need to make sure the proposal is actually fitting the criteria in terms of like to be there in the first place. Tommy, I saw you come off mute for a moment. You had anything else you wanted to mention?
Did I? Well, it just reminded me of this Monty Python skit with the bridge guard who says none shall pass. If you pass through that gatekeeper, then you have proven yourself and you're good to go.
Thank you, Tommy. All right, that time is cutting us short, but I'll briefly swim through a couple of others. Consideration for open source proposals. Again, something we touched upon, like where is the role, how is the role of the open source? I think one of the biggest challenges, especially if I cycle back to open source, Catalyst Open, was definition of open source. People have a very wide understanding of what it is. What are the different degrees or shades of open source? So I think that's something that we'll need to also double down in terms of the scope. We already know that there was a point of friction in Fund 10. Understanding what is open source and what are my requirements, what are definitions for developed? Yeah, that's fair enough as well. How do we limit number of proposals per proposer? ADA deposit locked upon submission. Again, probably rhymes with elements in terms of the future capabilities that we can incorporate through things like Catalyst voices if they are deployed in a shape and form as envisioned. Again, is it something feasible within the Fund 11 scope? I'd probably argue that not just quite yet in terms of managing, because you're essentially managing additional ADA, and unless you have a trustless solution on chain for the entire fund, it becomes very challenging. You have custody involved and things of that nature. So it's definitely an open pathway, but the technological readiness needs to catch up there. So that's where the things of like having better scope, requirements of like limitations per proposer. But again, as Chris mentioned, there's trade-offs to everything. Now it's relatively easy to find which proposers are interconnected or linked. Once we put these elements, the people will adjust to the game rules, as it always happens. greater than proposals. Yes, some things. What kind of registration will be implemented for those who participate in this layer? Many people only come to ecosystem when Project Catalyst is active. What additional recognition will be given to projects that work full-time in the ecosystem? I think this also speaks nicely that through the voices, we want to make sure that innovation's ongoing. So even though so there's always something to do as you're working through the proposals, that like if innovation's ongoing and it comes to the regular voting funding cycles, could that be streamlined so that it's not sort of like a cardiac arrest? I think I talked to somebody else that the Catalyst isn't like a cardiac arrest that you have a couple of times in a year, but it's sort of like a steady heartbeat, right? That people can see themselves to participate in, and you have continuous collaboration and innovation rather than big shocks. This would likely not solve the issue of competition, as newcomers and less known names would still have to compete with companies and well-known names. Companies would still put projects in new ideas, which speaks to what we chatted also before quite nicely.
Yes, quadratic deposits. That's right. So that was what I was putting there, Danny, was the greater than 2. Even if it's greater than 1 proposal, like you want to stop the spam, like everybody can put 1 proposal, 1 proposal for free, and then after your second proposal is a deposit, your third deposit, the third's bigger, fourth's bigger. Like somebody just put quadratic deposits. That's great.
Yeah. And you could also almost think about it. Maybe if you're having a low threshold entry in terms of like thinking about inclusiveness, that it's not providing that huge barrier to entry in terms of, because there's wide variety of people around the world.
That's
maybe,
right.
And maybe the first one has 0, right? And then you start
exactly.
having it, right?
Yes, that's what I wanted to capture. I want everyone to have that ability to put a proposal in. I never want to stop that. But we can stop the spam if it's the second or third proposal. You have to put a deposit in. Everyone after that, the deposit gets bigger. Christina's got her hand.
Yeah, that only works for people who don't have enough ADA. That does nothing for the bigger businesses who have a lot of it. It doesn't stop them at all.
Yeah, and that's the other side of the equation. And I get a lot of hate on places like Twitter when I try to sort of like show like, hey, there's the other side of the coin. Like it's very easy to go in this direction, but then people who can afford these things may not necessarily be a big showstopper, right? And in terms of where it goes. So there's definitely, again, we talked about the trade-offs, like where these things can pop in and where it makes sense and whatnot. But we won't be able to please everything and everyone at the end of the day, and wherever the line in the sand will be, somebody will be left out of it, somebody will be left in it, and just trying to figure out what is that optimal place that it just helps us push on the objectives. Anna?
Hello, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. Giving everybody the opportunity to put in a proposal, and then second, third one, you have to lock in some ADA. But I think it should not apply to all categories. Some certain categories can be exempt from that. Just my thoughts.
That's a
maybe
fair
the
point.
student.
Yeah, put it on the million ADA proposals. I'm great with that. Like that's exactly right. Put it on those high value proposals. Take it, to take it. Nothing on the lower, and that's the whole point of the lower end. It's like open that up, get as many people in, putting in proposals, bringing up real innovation in the space that's bubbling up from the community. I don't ever want to stop that. But what I'm looking at is on the high side when you've got people putting in 400,000 to $1 million plus per proposal, and putting was it 40 proposals this time? 48?
It depends if you count friends
from
and
one
family.
group. Yeah. Oh, that's right. Extended family. That's what it was. That's why it was 48. I think one was 24, and then there was another. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, it's people will push, people will pull, we push, we pull and push. And then we sort of like, the goal is sort of like not to fall asleep and sort of like go forward. Launching Fontaine has been incredibly challenging and difficult, just given the pause. So certain things just, had to be deprioritized. And again, this is why we couldn't do this in Fontaine altogether. We're trying to do it now, again, going forward into the Fund 11. And obviously we're not going to be able to implement everything and anything, but it sets us on a pathway that we can start having a conversation of peeling away that onion little by little, so that we don't have to make a huge jumps in there. All right, so I am conscious of the time, so I will pause us here for today. I do appreciate everybody's time and effort. I'm gonna try to see when to schedule the next one, so keep an eye on. I'll probably send it to you again via email here today, and then we'll also announce it on the town hall. Maybe we get also some extra blood next time as well. But I think today was equally nice for the being able to chat as well. I will leave the board open for the next day or two, if you would like to come back and maybe add extra stickies, because it is a public board. I will then request it to be locked down. You may be able to still leave a comment. I'll see. I just want to make sure we don't have any, a troll come in, or if the things get in a way that gets deleted or things of that nature. I have a backup of these things, but just to be sure that these things don't get lost, and then we can continue the conversation next time, where we either left off today or start picking upon some of those sticky points that we've had here in terms of the conversation today. Tommy, you were off mute, saw you?
No, just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you, Tommy. So thank you, Yoram. Thank you, Jeremy, helping out there also with the stickies. Christina, Quasar coming in late.
Thank you very much.
And I'll also be able to share the recording, so just keep an eye on it for the refresh. So good work, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Danny. Take care.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.